The emergency room had been silent for exactly 4 seconds when the military police came through the doors. Not walking, not jogging. Moving with the kind of deliberate speed that meant someone, somewhere, had already made a decision that couldn't be undone. They weren't there to arrest anyone. They were looking for her. The woman they'd thrown out 40 minutes ago. The one Dr. Marcus Holden had pointed at like she was a piece of furniture someone had left in the wrong room. Just a nurse. His exact words, in front of 7 staff members and 2 patients who were still conscious enough to hear it. Now an Army commander was standing in the middle of Westbrook Memorial's trauma bay, scanning faces, and the first thing he said wasn't a question. It was a name. Before you find out what happened next, if this story already has you hooked, follow along, hit like, and drop a comment telling me what city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. Now let's go back to where it started. Emily Carter had arrived at Westbrook Memorial on a Tuesday, which felt appropriately unremarkable. She'd driven up from Billings in a truck that needed new wiper blades and parked in the last spot in the employee lot, which was already a third full at 6:40 in the morning. She sat there for a moment with the engine off, watching a maintenance worker push a mop cart across the loading dock, and thought about nothing in particular. That was something she'd gotten good at, thinking about nothing in particular. She was 29 years old. She had a Montana nursing license, an associate's degree she'd finished online between deployments, and 4 years of experience in emergency medicine that didn't fit neatly onto any civilian resume because most of it had happened in places that weren't on any map she could show people. She'd been told, more than once, to leave that part vague. Previous military service, medical support role. That was enough. More than enough, usually. The HR orientation took 2 hours and covered things like badge access, parking validation, and the hospital's policy on personal cell phones during active patient care. The woman running it, a tired-looking administrator named Denise, had given Emily a lanyard and a temporary badge and said, "You'll shadow Dr. Holden's team in the ER for the first 2 weeks. He likes new staff to watch before they jump in." She'd said it the way people say things they're slightly embarrassed about. Emily had said, "That's fine," and meant it. The emergency department at Westbrook Memorial was a mid-sized trauma center serving Raven Falls and the surrounding 3 counties, about 80,000 people spread across a lot of very cold, very isolated terrain. It wasn't a level 1. It was a level 2, which meant it handled serious trauma, but transferred out anything that needed neurosurgery or advanced cardiac intervention. The staff was competent. The equipment was decent. The culture, Emily noticed within her first hour on the floor, was organized around one person's ego in the way that only happens when someone has been the smartest person in a room for too long. Dr. Marcus Holden was 44, trauma chief, 8 years. He was tall and spoke in complete sentences and had a habit of touching the back of his neck when he was about to say something he'd already decided was correct. The nurses called him Hawk behind his back, not because he was sharp-eyed, but because he circled. He'd walk a trauma bay 3 times before saying anything, building a kind of theatrical tension that Emily recognized immediately as performance. She watched him work her first morning and didn't say anything. He was technically skilled, fast hands, good instincts under pressure, efficient with the residents. He also interrupted the nurses twice, overrode a medication dosage that had already been confirmed with pharmacy, and spent 45 seconds explaining to a third-year resident why a decision the resident had already made correctly was, in fact, correct, just rephrased in Holden's own words. The nurses noticed Emily watching. One of them, a woman named Priya, who wore her stethoscope looped twice and moved like someone who'd been on this floor for a decade, came and stood next to her during a quiet moment around 10. "First week?" Priya said. "First day." "Where'd you come from?" Emily considered the question. "Military mostly. Did some agency work in Billings after." Priya nodded like this explained something. "He's going to test you," she said, not quietly enough, nodding toward Holden across the bay. "He does it with everyone new, finds something you did or said and uses it in front of people. If you react, it gets worse." "What do you do if you don't react?" "He finds something else." Priya looked at her sideways. "But it usually stops faster." Emily said, "Good to know," and went back to watching. The test came on Thursday. It wasn't spectacular as these things go. Holden had called a brief staff meeting at the end of the morning shift. 7 people gathered around the central nursing station, and he'd pulled up a protocol document on the wall display. Mass Casualty Intake Procedure. Westbrook Memorial's version, last updated 18 months ago. Emily had read it the night before. She'd read all the protocol documents the night before, partly out of habit, and partly because she didn't sleep well and needed something to do with the hours between 2 and 5 a.m. Holden was walking through the triage flow, how the team would categorize incoming patients in a mass casualty event, who communicated with EMS, how the trauma bays would be staged, and Emily had noticed something. Not a small thing. A sequencing problem in the communication chain that would, in a real event, create a gap of several minutes during which incoming patient counts wouldn't reach the charge nurse. In a low-volume event, it wouldn't matter. In something serious, those minutes could mean 3 or 4 patients sitting in the intake corridor without anyone knowing they were there. She waited until he paused. "Can I ask about the communication step between EMS dispatch and the charge station?" she said. "The protocol shows EMS notifying the trauma chief directly first. In a multi-vehicle event, that step adds about 3 to 4 minutes before the charge nurse gets a patient count. That could back up intake." Holden looked at her the way people look at something unexpected on a sidewalk, briefly with mild irritation before deciding to step around it. "That's standard protocol," he said. "EMS notifies trauma leadership first. That's how it works." "I understand that's the current protocol. I'm asking whether it's the most efficient sequence for a high-volume event." The room had gotten quiet in the way rooms get quiet when something is happening that everyone will talk about later. Holden set down the tablet he'd been holding. "And you're asking this because in mass casualty response, charge nurse situational awareness is usually prioritized over physician notification in the first 2 minutes. If the charge nurse doesn't have patient counts, staging falls apart before it starts." "You've been here," Holden said, "for 3 days. The sequencing issue doesn't change based on how long I've been here." Something shifted in his expression. Not anger exactly, more like a decision being made. He looked at the rest of the room for a moment. Nurses, 2 residents, a charge nurse named Gary who was staring at the floor, and then looked back at Emily. "You're a nurse," he said. "This is my trauma room. The protocol is set. If you have documentation concerns, you can put them in writing and submit them to administration. That process exists for a reason." He picked the tablet back up. "Stay out of my trauma room." Emily said "Yes, doctor," and didn't say anything else. She walked to the break room after, poured herself a cup of coffee that had been sitting too long and drank it anyway. Her hands were steady, her face was neutral. Priya came in 2 minutes later and stood by the sink without saying anything for a moment. "You okay?" Priya finally asked. "Yeah." "He meant it, the submit it in writing thing. He'll just ignore it, but I know." Emily set down the cup. "I'm going to submit it anyway." Priya looked at her. "Why?" "Because if something happens, I want a timestamp." She went home that evening, wrote a detailed memo outlining the protocol gap, cited 3 separate mass casualty management frameworks she happened to have memorized, and submitted it through the hospital's internal documentation system at 7:42 p.m. She got an automated confirmation receipt. She saved it. Then she sat on her apartment floor with her back against the couch and watched the ceiling for a while, because that's what she did when she was working through something she couldn't talk about with anyone. Friday started normally. She took 2 IV starts before 8, helped a resident talk through a pediatric fever case without making him feel like she was helping him, and ate half a granola bar over the supply cart during a 15-minute quiet stretch around 10. At 11:20, her phone buzzed. Every phone in the department buzzed. The alert system, the one that was supposed to go to the trauma chief first, then filter down, went to everyone simultaneously because whoever had configured the notification tree 3 years ago had apparently given up halfway through. Mass casualty event. Coordinated attack, highway interchange outside Raven Falls. Multiple vehicles, multiple victims, ETA unknown. All available ER staff report to staging positions. Emily was already moving before she finished reading it. The next 8 minutes were the gap between a plan and reality. The communication breakdown she'd outlined in her memo played out almost exactly as she described. EMS dispatch reached Holden's direct line, which he answered while still in a patient room, meaning the charge nurse, Gary, didn't get a patient count for 4.5 minutes. In that window, the first 2 ambulances arrived and sat in the intake corridor while Gary was still setting up the bay assignments. Emily didn't wait for direction. She went to intake, assessed the first 2 patients, 1 critical, 1 serious, and got them staged in the only 2 trauma bays that were currently clear. She told Gary what she'd done when he came through 30 seconds later. He nodded, already overwhelmed, and she could see him recalibrating, pulling her into the coordination loop without making a formal decision about it. The 3rd ambulance brought 4 patients. The 4th brought 3 more. Within 20 minutes, there were 16 patients in various states, 9 staff actively working, and a communication problem that was snowballing. Holden came through the double doors into the main trauma area, looking like a man who had just realized the building he was in was larger than he'd thought. He'd worked mass casualty drills. He had not, Emily assessed quickly, worked a real one. "I need a count," he said to no one in particular. Gary gave him what he had. 16 patients, 9 in active treatment, 3 critical, 4 serious, the rest walking wounded or observation. Holden started moving between bays, which wasn't wrong, but he wasn't assigning. He was assessing, doing the work of the individual clinician instead of the work of the person running the system. The residents were waiting for direction. 2 nurses were waiting for direction. A respiratory tech was standing near Bay 4 with equipment that needed to go to Bay 7, and nobody had told her that. Emily told her. Then she went to the dry erase board on the east wall and started writing patient assignments. Not because anyone had told her to, because the board was there. It was the fastest communication tool in the room, and nobody was using it. Priya appeared at her elbow. "Are you—" "Bay 3 needs a second IV line," Emily said. "The patient in Bay 6 is going to need airway support in the next 5 minutes. I'd get respiratory over there now. Bay 4's patient is more stable than she looks. She can wait." Priya stood there for half a second. Then she said, "Okay," and went. Holden noticed the board at some point. He looked at it, looked at Emily, and something crossed his face that wasn't quite readable. Not anger yet, more like disorientation. The expression of someone who has stepped into a room where the furniture has been rearranged. "Who authorized this?" he said, gesturing at the board. "Nobody," Emily said. "It needed to happen." "This is my emergency department." A monitor alarm cut him off. Bay 2. The critical patient, the one Emily had staged first, whose intubation setup she'd flagged to the resident on the way in because the positioning was slightly off. The resident was 26 years old and smart and had never intubated someone who was actively deteriorating while 6 other crises were happening simultaneously. He got the tube in but lost the seal, and the patient's oxygen saturation dropped fast. Emily was there in 4 steps. She didn't ask. She repositioned, resealed, asked for suction without raising her voice, got it, and the saturation started climbing. The whole thing took 90 seconds. The room had gone quiet in the particular way it goes quiet when something serious almost happened and then didn't. Holden was standing 5 feet away. He'd watched the whole thing. Emily stepped back from the bay, checked the board, started moving toward Bay 6 where the airway situation was developing, and that was the moment the exterior doors at the far end of the corridor opened. Not EMS, not hospital administration. 2 military police vehicles had pulled up to the ambulance bay, visible through the glass panels above the exterior doors. Uniformed personnel were moving fast, not toward the patients, but through the corridor with the specific trajectory of people looking for a location, not a situation. Gary's radio crackled. A voice said something. Gary's head came up. He looked across the room at Emily. She was already watching the doors. A man in uniform came through first, late 40s, combat patches on his shoulder, the kind of bearing that doesn't happen from desk work. Behind him, 2 more, and a woman in civilian clothes with a federal identification badge clipped to her jacket. The man in uniform stopped in the middle of the trauma bay. He looked at the board. He looked at the patients. He looked at the staff. He said loudly and clearly into a room that had gone completely still, "I'm looking for former Army combat medic Emily Carter." Nobody moved for a moment. Then Holden said from somewhere to Emily's left, "She's a nurse. She works here." The commander didn't look at him. He was looking at Emily, who was standing next to Bay 6, gloves still on, with a clipboard she'd been using to track patient status. "Sergeant Carter?" he said. Emily said, "Yes, sir." His expression shifted. Not surprise, something that looked more like relief. "We need you," he said. Behind her she heard Marcus Holden exhale, the specific sound of a man whose understanding of a situation has just collapsed. She didn't look back at him. "Tell me what you have," she said to the commander. The commander's name was Colonel Daniel Voss, and he talked fast, the way people talk when they've already done the math and don't like the answer. He pulled Emily 3 steps away from the bay, not for privacy. The room was too loud for that, but for focus. The woman with the federal badge stayed at his shoulder. Her name, she said, was Agent Renata Okafor, Department of Homeland Security, and she said it the way people say things they've said 100 times and stopped caring about. "Second event," Voss said, "coordinated. A fuel depot on Route 9 40 minutes ago. We have a secondary casualty site and the county hospital in Deering is already overwhelmed. They've declared internal disaster and diverted. Everything is coming here." Emily said, "How many?" "Current count is 31 additional. Could be 40 by the time transport arrives. We have military medical assets en route, but they're 22 minutes out. We need someone who can run this until they land." "What assets?" 2 combat surgical teams, a forward triage unit, and a field pharmacy. "I also have 2 flight medics on the first bird who can be in the building in about 18 minutes. Emily looked at the board. She did the math without appearing to do it, the kind of calculation that had become physical for her, something that happened below conscious thought, like breathing. Current capacity, current patient load, staff fatigue starting to show in 2 of the nurses who'd been on since 6, bay assignments that were already strained at 16 patients, the airway situation in Bay 6 that still needed resolution. 40 more patients was not a number this hospital could absorb with its current structure. "I need the ambulance bay cleared for military vehicle access," she said, "and I need your ranking medical officer on the phone right now so we're not duplicating command structure when your surgical teams walk in." Voss looked at her for a moment. Not surprised exactly, but something, assessing, recalibrating. "You haven't changed," he said. "I haven't had time to." She pulled off one glove, reached for a fresh one. "Bay 6 first. Then we restructure." She didn't ask for permission. She moved. Bay 6 was a 43-year-old man from the highway incident whose oxygen saturation had been hovering around 91 for the past 12 minutes, while his nurse waited for a physician order that hadn't come because Holden was across the room running a procedure he could have assigned to a resident. Emily checked the positioning, asked for a jaw thrust, got a bi-level machine set up from respiratory. The tech she'd redirected earlier had stayed in the area, which turned out to matter. And within 6 minutes, the saturation was climbing toward 96. The nurse on the bay, a young man named Torres, who'd been working there for 8 months, exhaled through his nose and said, "I've been flagging this for 20 minutes. "I know," Emily said. "Document the timeline." She said it without emphasis, but Torres understood what it meant. His eyes went briefly to the doorway where Holden was visible, and then back to his monitor. Emily moved. The next 40 minutes were the kind of time that doesn't feel like time. They feel like a series of decisions happening faster than thought, each one pulling the next one forward, with no space between them for anything except the immediate problem. She had worked in this state before. She knew how to live in it without losing herself inside it, which was the thing that took years to learn, and couldn't be taught in any classroom she'd ever seen. She ran the board. She assigned bays as they opened. She told a second-year resident, a quiet woman named Dr. Felice Moran, to run the walking wounded intake in the corridor because Moran had already shown she could triage quickly and stay calm, and putting her there freed up a bay for critical patients. She coordinated with Gary on supply pulls, talked the pharmacy tech through a controlled medication release for pain management across 6 patients simultaneously, and corrected a documentation error on a patient in Bay 9 that would have created a drug interaction problem 40 minutes later when that patient went to imaging. None of it was flawless. She made one assignment that she second-guessed immediately and corrected before anyone noticed. She had to ask Torres twice for a supply she couldn't find, because the storage in this ER was organized differently than anywhere she'd worked and she hadn't had time to learn it yet. She knocked a cup of saline off a cart at some point and didn't stop to pick it up and felt vaguely bad about it until she forgot. But the system held. More importantly, it started to tighten. Priya found her between bays 11 and 12. "The new ambulances are starting to come in," she said. "6 patients in the last wave, 2 critical." "Which entrance?" "South Bay. Gary's directing. Tell him to put the criticals in 7 and 8. I cleared 7 20 minutes ago and 8 just opened. And tell him to hold the others until I get a count." Emily was already moving. "And Priya, what's the status on the family waiting area? We need it for overflow." Priya hesitated. "Holden hasn't authorized." "I'll deal with that. Get me a head count first." She was aware, without tracking it directly, that Holden was watching her. He'd been watching her for the past 30 minutes in the way people watch something they can't categorize. He'd stopped circling. He wasn't doing nothing. He was still treating patients, still functioning as a physician, which to his credit he did without significant deterioration, even under pressure. But the organizational structure of the room had shifted underneath him, and he had noticed and didn't know what to do with it. He caught her at the nursing station when she came back for the board. "You're making patient assignments," he said. "Somebody has to." "That's my job." Emily looked at him steadily. She'd been on her feet for 3 hours now. The stress of the situation had compressed into something that lived at the base of her skull, and she did not have the energy for this performance. "You've been in Bay 3 for the past 16 minutes with a resident who could have managed that patient independently," she said. "There are 40 more incoming. The Bay assignments need continuous management. I'm the trauma chief. Then act like it." She said it without raising her voice, without cruelty, and without apology. "Run the floor. I'll run the board. That split works better than either of us doing both. You know that." He didn't say anything for 3 seconds. She didn't wait for him to. She picked up the marker and updated the board. Whatever Holden was feeling, she'd think about it later, or not. He stepped back. Not in defeat, exactly, in something more complicated. She heard him talking to a resident 30 seconds later, assigning, directing. She didn't look over. The military flight medics came in at 18 minutes, almost exactly when Voss had said. 2 of them, both in their early 30s, both with the compressed efficiency of people who had worked real emergencies in places this hospital had never imagined. One of them, a staff sergeant named Briggs, introduced herself to Emily by walking up and saying, "Where do you need us?" which was the correct question. And Emily had them deployed in 90 seconds. The second wave of patients hit 7 minutes later, 34 additional patients over the next 22 minutes. Not 40, because 2 had been redirected to a surgical center in Kendall that had more capacity than initially thought, but 34 was still a number that stretched everything. 3 were pediatric, which created a separate coordination problem because Westbrook Memorial's pediatric capacity was limited, and the 2 physicians who were trained for it were both working adult trauma. Briggs flagged Emily on the pediatric issue. "Your PEDS trained staff is maxed." "I know. What's your trauma certification in pediatric?" "Combat. Not the same. Close enough for stabilization." Emily made a decision she wasn't 100% comfortable with and documented it immediately in the system with reasoning, because if anything went wrong with those kids, she wanted the reasoning on record. She put Briggs with the 2 oldest pediatric patients, both teenagers, both with injuries within Briggs's demonstrated capability, and kept the youngest, a 7-year-old with a head injury, under the direct supervision of Dr. Moran, who had more pediatric exposure than anyone else currently available. The 7-year-old's name was Marcus. He had dark hair and a cut above his left eye, and he was unconscious when he came in, but his pupils were reactive, and the CT, when they got it, showed a concussion without hemorrhage. Emily checked on him twice between other tasks. She wasn't sure why. She checked on all the critical patients, but she found herself remembering where he was in the Bay rotation in a way she wasn't tracking the adults as specifically. She didn't examine that. She just kept moving. Colonel Voss's combat surgical teams arrived at the 40-minute mark, and with them came a restructuring problem Emily had anticipated. Military Medical Command has its own hierarchy, its own protocols, its own way of organizing a disaster response, and when it walks into a civilian facility in the middle of an active crisis, the 2 systems either integrate or they collide, and which one happens depends almost entirely on who's managing the interface. Voss handled his end well. He introduced his senior surgeon, a major named Delacroix, compact and precise, who looked at Emily's board for approximately 15 seconds and said, "This is good work," and then stepped aside to let Emily and Delacroix work out the integration. It took 4 minutes, not because it was easy, but because both of them understood the rules of their respective systems well enough to find the overlap. "Your surgical teams take overflow bays 13 through 18, Emily said, pointing. "I'll route criticals by your designation, stables by mine. Gary's the charge nurse and he's the communication hub. Everything goes through him on the logistics side." "Agreed," Delacroix said. "I'll need pharmacy access." "Already coordinated. The tech's name is Simmons. She's been running controlled releases all afternoon. She knows the drill." Delacroix nodded. "Who's the trauma chief here?" Emily said, "I'm Dr. Holden. He's been managing the primary bays." Delacroix looked across the room to where Holden was working. Something in his assessment took about a second. He didn't say anything, which was its own kind of statement. "Okay," he said, "let's work." The next 90 minutes were the kind that age a person in some ways and strip away pretense in others. Patients came in faster than beds opened. The supply chain strained and then adapted. 2 nurses hit the wall of exhaustion around the 2-hour mark and had to be rotated out. Emily caught it before they made errors, which meant watching people she'd known for 4 days and reading the signs from their body language, their reaction times, the way they held their clipboards. You either learn to read that, or you learn it the hard way when someone makes a mistake. She caught one mistake before it happened, a medication crossover on a patient in Bay 14 that would have happened because 2 handoffs had occurred in rapid succession and the documentation hadn't kept pace. She stopped it by happening to check the chart for an unrelated reason and seeing the discrepancy. It took 45 seconds to correct. The patient never knew. But someone else did. Agent Okafor had been in the building the whole time. Emily had almost forgotten about her, which, in retrospect, she should have found strange. The DHS agent hadn't been visible in the trauma area. She'd been somewhere else, doing something else, the specific nature of which Emily hadn't had the attention to wonder about. At the 2-hour mark, Okafor found her. Emily was in the corridor between bays, writing on the board, when Okafor stopped beside her and said quietly, "Can I have a minute?" "I have about 30 seconds. Okafor accepted that. "The attack wasn't random," she said. "We knew it was coming. We had intelligence." Emily kept writing. "Why are you telling me this?" "Because the intelligence included a name." A pause. "This hospital. Someone on staff was supposed to flag the response protocols for the attack. Something about the communication sequencing in the mass casualty procedure." Emily's hand stopped. She turned and looked at Okafor. "Who?" she said. Okafor's expression didn't change. "That's what we're still determining." She glanced down the corridor toward the main trauma bay, toward where Holden was visible through the window. "We pulled the internal documentation system records this afternoon. The flag on your protocol memo, the one you submitted yesterday at 7:42, was accessed this morning. Someone looked at it before the attack." The corridor was loud. Monitors, voices, the rhythmic beeping of equipment, the specific controlled chaos of a medical system under extreme strain. Emily said carefully, "You think someone used my memo to time something?" "I think someone knew what the gap in your protocol looked like from the outside," Okafor said. "And I think they knew it because they read a detailed internal document that described it in very precise terms." She held Emily's gaze. "Your document?" The board in Emily's hand suddenly felt heavier. "I submitted that through the standard system," Emily said. "Anyone with administrative access could have seen it." "Yes," Okafor said. "That's the problem." She handed Emily a card, physical, paper, which felt deliberately old-fashioned. "When your shift ends, I need to talk to you in detail. Don't discuss this with anyone here." She walked away without another word. Emily stood in the corridor for approximately 5 seconds. Then she went back to work because the board needed updating and Bay 16 had just signaled. And there was a patient in the corridor whose IV had infiltrated and needed to be restarted. She kept moving. She kept her face neutral. She kept her hands steady. But in the part of her mind that wasn't managing the emergency, The quiet part that never fully switched off, the part that had kept her alive in places she couldn't talk about. Something was running a different calculation entirely. Someone in this hospital had accessed her memo. Someone had read her precise, detailed description of exactly how the mass casualty communication protocol would fail. And 8 hours later, it had failed, in exactly the way she'd described, on the exact day she'd submitted the document. She restarted the IV on the corridor patient, a woman in her 50s who thanked her twice. Emily said, "You're all set," and meant it about the IV. About everything else, she wasn't sure. The pediatric patient, Marcus, the 7-year-old, opened his eyes at the 3-hour mark. Emily happened to be near the bay when it happened. The nurse on the bay, Torres, called it calmly, "PEDS patient in 6 is coming around." Emily came to the doorway. The boy was awake, disoriented, looking at the ceiling with the particular confusion of someone who doesn't know how they got where they are, which was fair. He said, "Where's my dog?" Torres said, "Your mom's in the waiting area, buddy. She's okay." The boy processed this slowly. "My dog was in the car." Emily stood in the doorway and watched Torres handle it with unexpected gentleness. He was young, Torres, and had seemed overwhelmed all afternoon, but he sat on the edge of the bay stool and said, "We'll find out about the dog, okay? But right now we need you to stay still for me." And the boy did. Emily went back to the board. The emotional weight of the afternoon had been accumulating in the specific way it does during extended high-stakes work, not in waves, but in layers, each one thin enough to ignore until they weren't. She was aware of it and set it aside, which was not the same as not feeling it. She'd learned that distinction in a different context, in a different country, when she was 23 years old and had to keep working for another 4 hours after something happened that she still didn't think about directly. At the 3.5-hour mark, the incoming patient flow finally began to slow, not stop. There were still people coming from the secondary site, and the transfer from Deering's diverted cases continued, but the pace dropped from acute crisis to sustained emergency, which was a meaningful difference. The surgical teams shifted from damage control to more deliberate stabilization work. Gary got a chance to update the tracking board for the first time in an hour and discovered that Emily's board, the marker on whiteboard version she'd been running parallel to the system, was more accurate than the electronic record, which had fallen behind during the peak volume period. He said quietly, "We're going to need to talk about this system." "Yes," Emily said, "but not today." Colonel Voss found her near the supply corridor around the 4-hour mark. He looked tired, which was the first time she'd seen that on him. The kind of tired that comes from command, from the sustained weight of responsibility for other people's decisions. "How are we looking?" he asked. "Stable," she said. "Not good, but stable. I'd say another 3 hours before the acute phase is fully resolved. Your surgical teams are solid." "They are." He paused. "You know Delacroix put your name on the response log." "I didn't ask him to." "He did it anyway." Voss leaned against the wall. The corridor was quieter now, relatively. "You want to tell me why you left?" The question landed flatly between them. Emily looked at the floor for a moment. "I've been asked that before." "And?" "And I usually say medical reasons." "That's what your file says." He waited. "But it's not the whole thing." She didn't answer right away. The sound of the hospital moved around them. Monitors, distant voices, the specific institutional hum of a building that had been pushed to its limit and was still standing. "There was a situation," she said. "An officer made a call I didn't agree with. I documented it. Nothing happened, and then it happened again, and 2 people got hurt who didn't need to get hurt." She kept her voice even. "I submitted a formal complaint and was told my documentation was procedurally insufficient. 3 months later, I was separated." Voss said nothing. "So," Emily said, "medical reasons." He was quiet for a moment. "You know the DHS agent has been pulling records all afternoon." "She told me." "What did she tell you?" Emily looked at him. "She told me not to discuss it with anyone here." She held the look for a second. "You're here." Something shifted in Voss's expression. Not offense, more like confirmation of something he'd already suspected. "Okafor operates independently," he said. "She doesn't coordinate with my unit." I know. But you should know what... Oh. He straightened up from the wall. That there are things moving in this building that started before today. Before the attack. Before your memo. He picked up his radio, checked something, set it back down. I'm not telling you to be scared. I'm telling you to watch your back. He walked away before she could respond. Emily stood in the supply corridor and looked at the far wall for a moment. A poster about hand hygiene. A maintenance schedule in a plastic sleeve. The ordinary, boring infrastructure of a building trying to function. She went back to the board. At the 4.5-hour mark, the hospital administrator, a man named Gerald Fitch, who had been conspicuously absent for most of the crisis, appeared on the floor. He was in his 60s, gray-suited, and had the look of someone who had been watching from a glass office and had only come down when it seemed safe to be seen. He looked at the room, he looked at the board, he looked at Emily. Then he looked at Holden, who was across the room. Holden met Fitch's gaze with the expression of a man who needed to say something but hadn't figured out yet what it should be. Fitch walked to Emily. Are you the one managing the board? He said. I've been coordinating with the charge nurse and the military teams, Emily said. Yes. You're the new nurse, Fitch said. It wasn't a question, but it had the shape of one. Emily Carter. I started Tuesday. He looked at the board again, then at the room, which was, against everything that had happened, holding together. Patients were stable, staff was functioning. The military integration had worked without incident. The secondary wave had been absorbed. Who authorized your role in this response? Fitch asked. Nobody, Emily said for the second time today. It needed to happen. Fitch opened his mouth. And that was the moment Holden crossed the room toward them, and Emily saw something in his posture that she hadn't seen all day. Not anger, not performance, not the careful positioning of someone protecting their territory. He looked shaken. He had something in his hand, printed paper, which was odd because everything in this hospital was digital. He'd printed something. He stopped in front of Fitch. He didn't look at Emily. Gerald, he said, I need to show you something. Fitch frowned. Now? Now. Holden's voice was flat in a way Emily hadn't heard before. It's about the protocol memo and the access log. Emily went still. Fitch looked between them. What access log? Someone accessed Emily's documentation last night, Holden said. The internal system keeps a login record. He held up the printed pages. I pulled it 20 minutes ago. The timestamp is 11:47 p.m. He paused. It was accessed from my office terminal. The corridor seemed to get quieter. I wasn't in my office at 11:47 last night, Holden said. I was at home. I can prove it. He finally looked at Emily. His face had shed whatever it had been wearing all day. What was underneath was something she hadn't expected. Not contrition, exactly, but something honest, something scared. Someone used my login, he said, and I think they wanted it to look like I was the one who passed the information. Emily looked at him for a long moment. Then she reached into her pocket and took out the card Agent Okafor had given her, and she held it for a second, looking at the number. Whatever this day had been, it had just become something else entirely. She called Okafor from the supply corridor, standing between a shelf of IV bags and a rack of clean linens, because it was the only place on the floor with enough ambient noise to cover a conversation and enough physical separation that no one would walk past without reason. Okafor picked up on the second ring. Holden says someone used his office terminal, Emily said. Login at 11:47 p.m. He has the printed access log. A pause. Not surprise. Okafor didn't seem built for surprise, but the specific silence of someone updating a calculation. Where is he now? With the hospital administrator, Gerald Fitch. He's showing Fitch the printout. Don't let Fitch take that document, Okafor said. Tell Holden to hold on to it physically until I get there. 2 minutes. She hung up. Emily went back to the corridor. Holden and Fitch were still standing where she'd left them, the printed pages between them like something neither one wanted to touch. Fitch was reading. His expression had the quality of a man whose quiet afternoon had been retroactively canceled. The agent wants you to keep that, Emily said to Holden. Don't hand it to anyone else. Holden looked at her. He was still holding the pages, which meant he hadn't given them to Fitch yet, which meant some instinct had already made the right call before she got there. You talked to her? Just now. Fitch looked between them with the expression of a man who understood he was the least informed person in a conversation happening around him. Would someone like to explain what's actually going on? Neither of them answered him immediately, which was its own answer. Okafor arrived in 90 seconds, not 2 minutes, which suggested she'd already been moving when Emily called. She came into the corridor, looked at the three of them, and said to Fitch, without preamble, "I need this area cleared. You can stay. Everyone else on the floor who isn't actively treating a patient should be moved back." Fitch sputtered, "This is my hospital." "And those are my federal credentials," Okafor said, pointing to the badge on her jacket without looking at it. "This is now a criminal investigation scene. I need the corridor clear, and I need that document." She looked at Holden. He handed it over. She read it in approximately 15 seconds. Something in her posture changed. Not dramatically, the way it would in a film, but in the small way that means a person has just confirmed something they already suspected and are now moving to the next phase. "Dr. Holden," she said, "I'm going to need your office, right now, and I'm going to need to know everyone who had physical access to it in the last 72 hours. Holden said, "My office is locked. I have the only key." "Who has a master key?" Fitch said quietly. "Facilities management and administration." Okafor looked at him. "I need a list of everyone in administration with building master access, and I need it before you do anything else." Fitch had the look of a man whose day had become something he'd need to talk to a lawyer about. He nodded and took out his phone. Emily watched all of this from a neutral position, 3 feet back from the group, and registered 2 things simultaneously: that the investigation had just visibly accelerated, and that she was now standing in the center of it whether she wanted to be or not. Her memo, her protocol analysis, her documentation, all of it was evidence in something she hadn't known she was documenting evidence for. She also registered, without letting it show, that Holden's behavior in the last 10 minutes had shifted the shape of the day in a way she was still processing. He hadn't protected himself. He'd come forward with information that implicated his own office terminal, and by extension, made himself a person of interest because the alternative, staying quiet, would have been worse. She wasn't sure whether to call that courage or just self-preservation. Maybe both. "Carter," Okafor turned to her, "I need your full account of the memo submission. Timeline, system access, who you told about it." "I told no one," Emily said. "I wrote it, submitted it through the internal documentation portal at 7:42 p.m., and received an automated confirmation. I didn't discuss the contents with any staff member before or after." "Did you discuss the protocol gap with anyone verbally before you wrote it down?" Emily thought back. The meeting. Holden's team. The 7 people in the room. "I raised it in the staff meeting Thursday morning, in front of Dr. Holden, 2 residents, and 4 nurses. Names?" She gave them. All 6. Okafor was writing in a small notebook, physical paper again, and Emily noticed she wrote in a compressed shorthand that wasn't quite any system Emily recognized. The meeting was Thursday. The attack was today, Friday. That's a 26-hour window from verbal disclosure to event. Yes. Did anyone in that meeting react in a way that stood out? Emily thought about it honestly, which meant not defaulting to the easy answer. Holden was dismissive. The residents didn't react much. One of the nurses... She paused. A nurse named Gary Spence, the charge nurse. He left the meeting early, about 5 minutes before it ended. I don't know why. Okafor wrote that down. Then, from the far end of the corridor, Colonel Voss appeared. He moved like someone who'd been briefed on the way over. He looked at Okafor, then at Emily, then at the pages in Okafor's hand. "Tell me it's not the charge nurse," he said. Okafor said, "We're not there yet." "Renata." His voice dropped, not angry, but weighted. "I need to know what I'm working with. And I'll tell you when I have something confirmed." She met his eyes evenly. It was clearly a conversation they'd had before, in some form, in some other context. "Give me the office and 90 minutes." Voss looked at Emily. The look wasn't a question exactly, but it had a question inside it. She's been professional, Emily said, which was the most accurate thing she could offer about Okafor. And she's been ahead of this since before I knew there was a this. Voss exhaled through his nose. 90 minutes, he said to Okafor. Then we coordinate. He walked back toward the trauma bay. Okafor watched him go, then turned to Fitch. Office. Now. Fitch led them down the hall. Emily didn't follow. She went back to the board because there were still patients, and patients didn't stop being patients because a federal investigation had started in the corridor. But she stopped at the nursing station first. Gary was there, updating the electronic record from her whiteboard notes, the work of reconciling the analog system she'd built under pressure with the digital one that had fallen behind. He was focused, efficient, doing the job with the same composure he'd shown all afternoon. She watched him for a moment. He looked up. You okay? Just checking the count, she said. What's our current on Bay 9? He told her. She wrote it down. She moved on. She hated that she was now looking at a person she'd worked alongside all day and running a different kind of triage. It wasn't a feeling she examined. It was just a fact. The next hour was the longest kind of long. The kind where the acute crisis has passed its peak but hasn't ended, where the patients are more stable but the work is still grinding, where the staff is running on the cold side of adrenaline and making the small errors that come from exhaustion rather than panic. Emily caught 2 of those errors, flagged them without assigning blame, corrected the documentation. She got Priya to take a 20-minute break because Priya's hands had started to move with the slight imprecision that means a person's fine motor coordination is operating on fumes. Priya didn't argue, which meant she'd already noticed it herself. The military surgical teams were wrapping their procedures. Delacroix found Emily at the board around the 6-hour mark and said, "We're going to move 3 post-op patients to your recovery ward. I'll need your nursing staff briefed on the post-op protocols." "Give me the protocols and I'll brief them now," Emily said. He handed her a tablet with the documentation. She read it in 4 minutes. She'd always been a fast reader, which was one of those skills that looks unimpressive until it's the only thing standing between you and a missed detail. And then gathered Torres, Priya, and 2 other nurses for a 10-minute handoff briefing that covered everything Delacroix's team needed them to know. Torres said, after, "Where did you learn to read medical documentation that fast?" "Practice," Emily said, which was true and told him nothing. She was walking back toward the nursing station when the first sign came. Not dramatic, not cinematic. A door opening at the far end of the administrative hallway. The hallway that led to Holden's office, and beyond it to Fitch's office, and beyond that to the records room. And Agent Okafor coming out with a look on her face that Emily had not seen before. Not the controlled neutrality of the last several hours. Something sharper. Something that had found a target. Behind her came Voss. And behind Voss, a man Emily didn't recognize. 40s, civilian clothes, a federal badge that was a different color from Okafor's. They walked toward the nursing station with the specific velocity of people who have made a decision. Okafor stopped in front of Emily. "I need you to keep the staff calm," she said. "We're making an arrest." Emily said, "Who?" Okafor looked past her toward the nursing station. Gary was still at the computer, still updating records. His back was to them. He had a particular stillness about him that Emily, looking at it now with different eyes, recognized as something other than calm. He'd heard them coming. He turned around slowly. His face was composed in the way that requires effort, the wrong kind of effort, the kind that comes from deciding how to look rather than just being. He looked at Emily first, not at Okafor, not at the federal badge, at Emily. "I knew you were going to be a problem," he said. Not loud, not angry, almost conversational. Emily said nothing. The unidentified federal agent moved left, Okafor moved right. Gary looked at the space between them and made a calculation that took about a second, and then he sat down in his chair. Not in compliance, in the specific way of a person deciding that this is where they're going to make their stand. "I want a lawyer," he said. "That's your right," Okafor said, and she said it without any theatrical flourish, without satisfaction, the way people do real things as opposed to performed things. "Stand up, please." He stood up. As he did, he looked at Emily one more time, Whatever he was looking for in her face, he didn't find it, or he did find it and didn't like it. Either way, he looked away first. The arrest happened the way real arrests happen, without drama, in the middle of a functional space, surrounded by the ordinary ongoing business of a place that didn't stop because something significant was occurring in its corridor. Torres saw it from bay doorway and went still. Priya, coming back from her break, stopped at the corner and took it in with the expression of someone who had wondered something for a while and had just gotten an answer. Holden came out of Bay 3. He saw Gary in handcuffs. He stood there. He'd spent all day trying to protect his floor, had been wrong about who the threat was, had been wrong about Emily, had been right about the terminal access, and had come forward with it in time to matter. He wasn't a good administrator, and he wasn't a careful listener, and he had a significant ego problem. He was also apparently not the person who had fed the hospital's internal security gap to someone who used it to time an attack. Emily watched him process that. It was complicated and took longer than it should have, which was human. She went to him. "Go check on Bay 4, she said. "The patient there needs a discharge assessment." He looked at her. Something moved in his expression, but not gratitude exactly, more like the look of a man who has been given a task when he needs one. He went. She turned back to Okafor. "What do you have?" "Enough," Okafor said. The office terminal access was remote, his home laptop using Holden's stolen credentials. But the memo access also pinged a secondary device, a personal phone, registered to Spence, that was on the hospital Wi-Fi at 11:47 p.m. She paused. He was here, after his shift, accessing an administrative terminal remotely while physically present in the building. Why? That's the part we're still working on. She held Emily's gaze. He had contact with an external party connected to the attack. We've been tracking that party for 11 months. The protocol gap in your memo was the operational piece they were waiting for, confirmation that the hospital's mass casualty response had a specific exploitable window. Emily stood with that for a moment. The weight of it was strange, not guilt, because she'd done nothing wrong, but the particular disorientation of knowing your precise and careful work had been used as a weapon. "He was in the meeting," she said, "when I raised the protocol issue." "Yes," and then he accessed the written version to confirm the details, and transmitted the sequence to his contact within 4 hours. Okafor's voice stayed flat. "We believe the attack was already planned. The protocol gap confirmed the timing window." The full shape of it settled into Emily's understanding like something cold. She had documented a flaw in the hospital's emergency system in order to protect patients. Someone had used that documentation to optimize an attack, and the person who had used it had been standing next to her all day, working alongside her, handing her supplies, coordinating patient assignments, doing the job. "He was good," she said. "They usually are," Okafor said. "That's not a comfort, I know, but it's true." She walked away to coordinate the transport of Gary Spence to federal custody, leaving Emily in the corridor. The hospital was quieter now. The surgical teams were in post-op mode. The trauma bays were thinning. The sound of the building had shifted from acute crisis to managed emergency, and underneath that, something was starting to emerge. The specific aftertone of a place that has been through something and is figuring out what it means. Emily went to the board. She updated the patient count, 47 patients admitted, 6 transferred to higher-level care, 3 pediatrics stable. The 7-year-old Marcus had been moved to a ward room and was reportedly asking about his dog again, which Torres had told her with the tone of someone who found it both exhausting and slightly heartening. Nobody had reported yet on the dog. She stood at the board and looked at the numbers for a moment. 47 people who had come through those doors in the worst moment of their day and had needed the system to hold. And the system had held, not because of the protocols, which had failed exactly as she'd said they would, but because the people in the building had been good enough and fast enough and willing enough to adapt. She was aware, standing there, that she was very tired. Not the kind of tired that sleep fixes immediately. The deeper kind. The kind that comes from spending 6+ hours in the place where decisions have real consequences, and you can see them in real time on the faces of people who are alive because something went right. She put the marker down. Colonel Voss was behind her. She'd heard him coming, not sneaking, just moving quietly. and had registered his approach without turning around. Okafor's people are done in Holden's office, he said. They found a secondary communication device in the maintenance access panel inside the wall. Emily turned. In Holden's office. Behind a vent panel, not Holden's. Spence had maintenance access. He could have installed it months ago. Voss looked at the board. At the numbers. The device was transmitting internal communications, not just the documentation system. Internal radio channels, intercom, the works. Emily said, For how long? We don't know yet. She thought about every conversation she'd had inside this building, 3 days of them, then thought about everyone else, every nurse, every doctor, every administrator, every patient who had spoken inside these walls during whatever window that device had been active. Months, she said. Possibly. The floor around them was quiet. Staff moved in the background, professional and focused, doing the ongoing work that doesn't pause for revelations. There's something else, Voss said. He reached into his jacket, an actual jacket pocket, not a briefcase or a tablet, and came out with a folded document. He held it without opening it. I got this from my JAG officer an hour ago. I've been waiting for the right moment. Emily looked at the document. What is it? He held it out. She took it, unfolded it, read the header. It was a record, her service record. Not the version she'd been given when she separated. The redacted version, the one that said medical separation and left 4 years of operational history as a blank space labeled details classified. This was the original, unredacted. The full account of what she'd done, where she'd been, under whose command, with what outcomes. She stood in the corridor of Westbrook Memorial Hospital in Raven Falls, Montana, holding the documentation of a version of herself that had been deliberately erased, and felt something move through her that she wasn't prepared to name. How did you get this? She said. The same people who buried it can unbury it, Voss said. And the people who buried it are having a very bad week for unrelated reasons. He paused. The IG investigation that started 8 months ago, the officer you filed the complaint against. It went further than they told you. She looked up. He's not the only one, Voss said. The complaint you filed was procedurally buried, deliberately, by someone above him who had reasons to make it disappear. He held her gaze. Those reasons are now a matter of federal record, and so is your original complaint. The corridor felt very still. Emily folded the document carefully along its original creases and held it at her side. What does that mean for me? She said. Voss opened his mouth to answer, and then every phone in the building went off simultaneously. Not the regular alert tone, but the secondary emergency channel, the one that only activated for events that had no routine category. And the message on Emily's phone, when she looked at it, made the question she'd just asked feel very far away. Secondary device activated. Internal. Location unknown. Building lockdown initiated. The lights in the corridor flickered once. Then the power went to emergency backup. And somewhere, in the walls of Westbrook Memorial Hospital, something that had been installed months ago and had been listening to everything and everyone started doing something else entirely. The emergency lighting was amber, which made everything look older and more tired than it was. Emily moved before the alert tone finished cycling. She went left, toward the main trauma bay, because that's where the patients were and where a power disruption would hit first in terms of equipment dependency. Behind her, she heard Voss on his radio, clipped and fast, calling his unit to building positions. Okafor was already on her phone, walking in the opposite direction, toward the administrative wing where Gary Spence was being held in a temporary custody arrangement that had just become significantly more complicated. The trauma bay was controlled chaos. The nurses had shifted to backup protocols automatically, the way well-trained people do, checking ventilators, verifying monitor battery levels, running the mental checklist that gets drilled until it's faster than thought. Delacroix was at the center of it, calm in the way of someone who had practiced medicine in conditions where the power going out was a Tuesday problem and not a crisis. Equipment status, Emily said to Torres, who was nearest. Vents are on battery. Monitors are up. Bay 4's infusion pump flagged, but it's not critical. I switched to gravity flow. Good. How long on the vent batteries? 4 hours minimum. 6 on 2 of them. She did the calculation. If this was a localized disruption, they'd be fine. If it was extended, the 3 post-op patients were the vulnerability, they were the most equipment-dependent, and the most recently out of surgery. She told Torres to check on them in that order and flag anything that looked like it was trending wrong. Then she turned to find Briggs, the flight medic, who had been working the floor since the second wave arrived. Briggs was near Bay 12, and she looked at Emily with the expression of someone waiting to be assigned. "The device they found," Emily said, keeping her voice down. "The secondary one, do you know what type?" Briggs shook her head. "Voss didn't brief me on device specifics. If it's a communication device like the first one, there's no physical threat from activation. If it's something else, then we're running a different problem," Briggs said. She didn't say it dramatically. She said it the way you say the sky is gray. "Do you want me to do a sweep?" "Not alone. Wait for Voss's team." Emily went to the nursing station and picked up the internal phone, the landline, which ran on its own circuit separate from the main power grid. She called the charge desk for the administrative wing. No answer. She tried the pharmacy. Picked up on the third ring a technician named Simmons who had been steady all afternoon and sounded steady now. "We're on backup. Everything's accounted for. Lock the controlled substance cabinet manually, and don't open it for anyone without a physician ID and a witness. Don't let anyone in the pharmacy who you don't recognize." A pause. "Is something happening?" "Precaution," Emily said. "Stay on this line if you need to reach me directly." She hung up. Voss was back, moving toward her from the corridor entrance with 2 of his uniformed personnel. "Device is in the north maintenance shaft," he said. "My EOD team is on it. Preliminary assessment says it's electronic, not explosive. But preliminary is preliminary. Timeline on full assessment. 20 minutes. Could be faster." "What's Okafor's read?" "She's with Spence. He lawyered up, but..." Voss paused, which was unusual for him. "He's talking anyway. People do that sometimes when they realize the situation is past a certain point." Emily looked at him. "What's he saying?" "That he wasn't alone." Voss's voice dropped another register. "That there's a second person inside the building. Someone who's been here longer than him and goes deeper in the network." The amber light made it hard to read faces, which was inconvenient. "Does he have a name?" Emily said. "He gave one," Voss said. "That's why Okafor is still in the room with him." He looked at her steadily. "He said the name is Fitch." Gerald Fitch had been hospital administrator at Westbrook Memorial for 11 years. Emily had known him for approximately 6 hours and had formed the assessment, based on limited data, that he was a man of institutional instincts, someone who navigated by the gravity of whoever was most powerful in a room, who spoke in the cadence of decisions already made by committees, who had the specific affect of people who have held positions long enough to mistake the position for the person. She had not assessed him as a threat. She reassessed. "Where is he?" she said. "That's the current question," Voss said. He hadn't been in the corridor when the lockdown alert went out. Emily replayed the last 15 minutes in her head. The precise sequence, who was where, who moved when. Fitch had been standing with Okafor and Holden when Gary was arrested. After that, in the transition to the administrative wing, she had not tracked him specifically. She had not had reason to. "Pull the security footage," she said. "The main security system is on the same power circuit as the wing we lost," Voss said. "We have footage up until 7 minutes ago. After that, backup cameras only, and those cover exits and the ER entrance, not interior corridors." So he had a window. 7 minutes is a meaningful window. Emily looked at the floor plan mounted on the wall beside the nursing station. The simple laminated reference map that had been there since before she arrived, and that she'd memorized on day 2 out of habit. The north maintenance shaft where the device was located connected to a service corridor that ran the length of the building. That corridor had 4 access points: the basement utility room, the maintenance bay near the loading dock, the administrative wing supply room, and the roof access stairwell. She said, "Your EOD team entered the north shaft from which end?" "Basement utility." "That leaves 3 access points they didn't come through. If someone wanted to reach that device after the alert, they'd use one of the other 3. Voss was already on the radio. Emily looked at Briggs. The roof stairwell, Briggs said. On it, and was moving before Emily finished the sentence, pulling one of Voss's personnel with her, who had apparently made the same calculation. Emily stayed on the floor. This was a deliberate choice. She had patience. She had staff who were managing controlled but not resolved equipment situations. She had a pharmacy that needed its communication line kept open, and 3 post-op patients whose status she didn't fully trust yet. She could not run down a maintenance corridor after a man she'd met 6 hours ago on the basis of a theory, because the floor needed someone running the floor. This was a thing she'd learned the way most things worth knowing get learned, through a situation where she'd made the wrong choice and lived with the result. You don't abandon the patients you can see for the crisis you can't yet locate. You hold the position and let the people with the right equipment and training run the problem. She went back to Bay 3. The patient there was a 61-year-old man named William Dre, who had been in the first wave and had a left-side chest injury that had been stabilized but that she hadn't liked the look of for the last hour. The resident assigned to him, Felice Moran, was watching the monitor with the specific attention of someone who also hadn't liked something. "What are you seeing?" Emily said. "His pressure's drifting, not dramatically, but it's directional." Moran had a precise way of speaking that Emily had come to appreciate. No padding, no hedging beyond what was clinically honest. "I want to repeat the chest x-ray, but we're running imaging on backup and there's a queue." "Get him to the front of the queue," Emily said. "Tell imaging it's a trauma reassessment on an unstable chest, not an elective follow-up. Holden has to authorize priority imaging." "Then let's find Holden." He was in Bay 7. Emily gave him the situation in under 30 seconds. He listened. Actually listened, without the performance she'd seen Thursday, and said, "Agreed. I'll call it in." He did. The call took 45 seconds. When he hung up, he said, without looking at Emily directly, "The imaging tech said we have a 15-minute wait on the backup system. I'll go with him." She said, "Good." He started to move, then stopped. "The charge nurse," he said. "Gary? He's in federal custody." "I know." Holden was quiet for a moment. I thought he was. I don't know what I thought." He looked at his hands, which were clean because he'd recently scrubbed for something and had the particular dryness of hands that get washed constantly in cold institutional water. "I supervised him for 3 years." Emily didn't have a useful thing to say to that, so she didn't say anything. "I should have listened to you Thursday," Holden said. It came out flat, not self-flagellating, more like a statement of clinical fact that he'd been working toward all day. "Not just the protocol, the meeting, the way I handled it." "You can document that if you want to," she said. "The protocol revision still needs to go through. This is a good reason to push it through fast." "Yeah." He looked at the bay. "Yeah, okay." He went with Moran toward imaging. Emily updated the board. In the wall around her, behind the panels and inside the infrastructure that most people who work in a building never think about, Voss's EOD team was working the device, and Briggs was somewhere in the stairwell, and Okafor was somewhere in a room with a man who was telling her things in the specific way of someone buying incremental safety with incremental information. 17 minutes passed. Emily tracked them against patient tasks. Medication check on Bay 11, wound assessment on Bay 13, a brief conversation with the pediatric consult who had finally arrived from Deering via a diverted transfer and was evaluating the 2 teenage patients Briggs had been managing. The consult, a compact woman named Dr. Adeze, who had driven 40 minutes through post-event traffic to be there, looked at both patients, looked at Briggs's documentation, and said, "This is solid field work." She said it to the room, not to anyone specifically. Briggs wasn't there to hear it. At the 22-minute mark, Voss came back to the nursing station. He had a look that Emily was learning to read. The closed expression of someone who has information that has settled into a specific shape. "EOD cleared the device," he said. It was a remote signal booster. Extended the range of the primary listening device in Holden's office, probably installed when the first one went in. But they found something else in the same panel. He held out his phone. A photograph? The inside of a maintenance access panel, and inside it, along with the signal booster, a second device that was smaller, denser, and had a different kind of component profile. Emily looked at it. "That's a data transmitter." "Medical records relay," Voss said. We think it's been pulling patient records and transmitting them externally. Not all of them. Targeted pulls based on parameters we haven't fully decoded yet. He paused. We think it's tied to a research fraud operation. Insurance billing manipulation, possibly pharmaceutical trial data. The attack today may have been partly cover for the extraction of a specific set of records before the operation got shut down. She stood with that for a moment. The weight of it was accumulative. Not just one thing, but a system of things, built over months, embedded in the walls of a hospital that handled the most vulnerable people in its county. The attack on the highway hadn't been the primary crime. It had been the noise created to cover the real theft. Fitch, she said. Fitch has been administrator for 11 years, Voss said. The timeline on the transmitter installation is estimated at 14 to 18 months. Whatever he's been feeding out, it's been going for a long time. And Gary Spence? Recruited, probably 8-9 months ago. His job was to monitor the internal response systems, make sure nobody noticed what the transmitter was pulling, and flag any internal investigations or documentation that might expose the operation. He looked at her. Your memo was the first internal document that specifically identified a procedural vulnerability. If it had gone to administration through normal channels and someone had investigated the protocol gap, it could have led to a broader audit of the documentation system, and that audit would have found the transmitter. Emily said quietly, So he used my memo to time the attack, not because the attack needed the protocol gap specifically, because the attack needed to happen before the audit did. That's the current theory. She looked at the board, patient counts, medication schedules, the clean, functional grid of a system doing its job despite everything that had been built into its walls to compromise it. Where's Fitch? She said. That, Voss said, is what we're about to find out. Briggs had not found Fitch in the roof stairwell. She'd found something else, a door to the stairwell propped open with a maintenance wedge, which hadn't been there when her shift started, and which told a specific story about recent intentional movement. She'd followed the stairwell down, not up, because most people who need to leave a building in a hurry think about exits, not heights. At the sub-basement level, the level below the utility room, the level that connected to the building's original 1970s infrastructure and that most of the current staff had never had reason to visit, she'd found a room. She called Voss when she found it. Voss relayed it to Emily, and Emily went, because this had crossed from medical emergency into something that she needed to see firsthand to understand. The sub-basement smelled like old concrete and conduit insulation, and the specific chemical undertone of equipment that runs constantly without being serviced. The lighting was functional but yellowed, two of the fluorescent panels buzzing at different frequencies in a way that set the teeth on edge. Briggs met them at the bottom of the stairs with one of Voss's personnel, a specialist named Carr, who had the quiet thoroughness of someone trained for exactly this kind of environment. The room Briggs had found was at the far end of the sub-basement corridor. Originally a record storage space, based on the shelf marks still visible on the walls. Currently, a second workstation, a laptop, closed, 2 external drives, a portable router with a cellular signal booster separate from anything installed in the walls, a folding chair, a half-eaten container of takeout that was still warm enough to be recent, and on the table beside the laptop, a hospital ID badge, not Fitch's. Emily looked at it. The photo was Fitch, the institutional headshot all administrators had, the kind taken under harsh lighting by a photographer who has done this 12,000 times and has no remaining interest in making anyone look human. But the name on the badge wasn't Fitch's name. It was a name she didn't recognize. An older badge format, the style Westbrook Memorial had used before switching systems, approximately 4 years ago. She looked at Voss. He was already looking at her. He's been here longer than 11 years, she said. Under a different name, Voss said. He was on the radio within seconds, relaying the badge information to Okafor. Okafor's response came back in under a minute. Her voice over the radio was controlled but had an undertone of something that in a less professionally contained person would have been urgency. The name on that badge corresponds to a federal identity flag from 9 years ago. Securities fraud case, medical billing operation in 3 states. The subject was believed to have relocated and assumed a new identity. Carr said, So Fitch isn't Fitch. Fitch hasn't been Fitch for at least 9 years, Voss said. He looked at the room around them, the laptop, the drives, the portable setup, the chair. He built this over time. Started here under a clean identity, built credibility, built access, started the operation. He picked up the laptop, gloved, and handed it to Carr. Everything on here is evidence. Emily looked at the takeout container. Still warm. She touched the outside with the back of her hand. The non-sterile surface, the risk assessment reflex of someone who'd been doing medical work all day. Still warm meant recent, 45 minutes, maybe less. He was down here when the lockdown went out, she said. He's been down here managing the extraction remotely. Was, Briggs said. She pointed to the far corner of the room. A second door, barely visible as a seam in the wall panel, the kind of door that gets built into older institutional buildings for maintenance access and then gets forgotten by everyone except the building schematics and the people who have read them carefully. The door was slightly ajar. Voss said, into his radio, "All exterior positions, we have a secondary egress from the sub-basement level. North side of the building, maintenance access. Seal it." A pause, then a voice over the radio, one of the exterior personnel. "North side maintenance door is open, sir. We've got tracks in the mud." Direction? North, toward the service road. Voss was moving before the response finished. Carr and Briggs were with him. Emily stood in the sub-basement room for a moment, the laptop, the drives, the old badge, the warm takeout container, and then she followed, because this was the part she needed to see close enough to document accurately. The chase, if it could be called that, lasted 11 minutes and covered approximately 400 meters of uneven ground between the hospital's north face and the service road. Emily did not participate in the chase directly. She stayed with Carr at the door, tracked via radio, and listened to the spatial collapse of the situation in real time. Fitch, or whoever he actually was, had a head start of several minutes and was moving with the focused speed of a man who had spent some portion of the last 9 years thinking about exactly this scenario. He'd made it to the service road. There was a vehicle there. An ordinary gray sedan, the kind that blends into any parking lot in any city, registered, Emily would later learn, to a name that was as fabricated as the name on his hospital badge. He didn't make it to the vehicle. 2 of Voss's exterior personnel had sealed the road from the east. Okafor, who had apparently exited the building through the loading dock the moment Voss called the egress over the radio, had come around from the west. She was faster on foot than her composed professional manner suggested, which was maybe the least surprising thing about the day. The arrest happened on a service road in the gray Montana afternoon with the hospital visible in the background and the mountains behind that, and a sky that had been overcast since morning and hadn't changed its mind. Emily came through the maintenance door in time to see the secondary cuffs go on, which was what it looked like. Administrative, procedural, 2 federal agents doing a job they had done before, and then the man who had called himself Gerald Fitch for 11 years was walked to a federal vehicle and the door closed. She stood on the service road for a moment. The air was cold, genuinely cold, the kind of Montana October cold that gets into the joints if you're standing still long enough. She'd been on her feet for close to 7 hours. The adrenaline of the last several hours had been metabolizing for a while now, and what was left wasn't calm so much as the absence of emergency, which felt unfamiliar enough to be almost disorienting. Voss appeared beside her. He looked at the vehicle driving away and then looked at the hospital behind them. "You should get inside," he said. "Your patients." "My patients have good people with them," she said. But she started walking back anyway. Ba-boom. The hospital's main power was restored at the 90-minute mark after the lockdown alert. When the full lighting came back on, the ordinary fluorescent institutional white, not the amber emergency tint, it had the odd effect of making the building look different. Not because anything had changed, but because people perceive spaces differently when the lighting is normal. The ordinary resumed its ordinary appearance, and that was its own kind of strange after the last several hours. Emily was at the nursing station when the lights came back. She looked up when they did, and around her the staff did the same. A collective breath, a collective recalibration. Torres made a sound that was not quite a word, but communicated relief. Priya, back from a second break she'd apparently taken at some point during the sub-basement excursion, looked at the fully lit bay and then at Emily. "Do we know what happened?" Priya said. "Some of it," Emily said. "More will come out." "Gary," Priya said, not a question. "Yes." Priya was quiet for a moment, the particular quiet of someone sitting with a betrayal that's still fresh enough to be unprocessed. She'd worked with Gary for 4 years. Emily didn't know what that felt like from the inside, and she didn't try to simulate it. "He was good at the job," Priya finally said. "He was," Emily said. "Both parts of it." She went back to the board. Patient count, status update, the ongoing work that the emergency had temporarily reorganized but hadn't eliminated. Holden came back from imaging at the next mark with Moran. The chest X-ray on William Dre had shown early pleural effusion, fluid accumulating where it shouldn't, which explained the pressure drift Moran had caught. Holden ordered a drain. Emily coordinated the equipment pull and set up the bay while Holden walked Dre through what was happening, and she noticed that Holden was direct with him without being clinical in the cold way, which she hadn't expected. The drain took 40 minutes. Afterward, Dre's pressure stabilized within 20 minutes, and Moran documented it with the understated satisfaction of someone who had caught something important before it became irreversible. Emily signed off on the documentation as the coordinating nurse and flagged it for the quality review that would come later, because it was a good catch that deserved to be visible in the record. Then she sat down. For the first time in 7 hours, she sat down. At the nursing station, on the rolling stool that was slightly too low for the desk, and that everyone compensated for by hunching in a way that would cause back problems eventually, and she put her hands flat on the surface in front of her and looked at the board. The board was mostly green. Green meaning stable, managed, accounted for. 2 yellows. Ongoing monitoring, watchful waiting. 1 red that had been a red since the first wave and was now a managed red. Serious, but not immediately deteriorating. She had submitted a protocol memo 4 days into a new job. Someone had used it to time an attack. And now 47 people were alive who might not be. And a federal investigation was in motion that would take months to fully resolve. And the charge nurse she'd been working alongside had been arrested, and the hospital administrator had turned out to be a man using a different name with a 9-year history of institutional fraud. She was deeply tired. She was also, underneath the tiredness, something that wasn't quite all right but was adjacent to it. The feeling of a system that has been under extreme pressure and has held, not perfectly, not without damage, but held. Okafor found her there, sat down in the chair next to the station, which was for family consultations and wasn't normally occupied by federal agents, but the day had been full of normally. "He's talking," she said. "Fitch?" His real name is Aldous Reinhardt. He's been operating under constructed identities for approximately 14 years. Westbrook Memorial was his 3rd institutional placement. She set a small recorder on the desk. Off, capped. The data operation here was the largest. He built it over 11 years. The patient records he was extracting were being sold to a pharmaceutical research consortium that was running trials off the grid, using real patient data without consent to inform drug development. The billing manipulation was secondary income. Emily looked at the recorder. "And the attack today?" "His network arranged it. Gary Spence flagged your memo as a risk to the operation. Reinhardt approved the call. The attack was designed to create the kind of institutional chaos that would delay any internal investigation by weeks, give the data extraction time to complete its final pull, and allow Reinhardt to disappear in the confusion." Okafor's voice stayed even. He had a full exit package ready. The sub-basement room was the final staging point. "He almost made it," Emily said. "He almost made it," Okafor agreed. "Your memo accelerated the timeline, which accelerated his response, which accelerated ours." She paused. "If you hadn't submitted it when you did, we might not have had the trigger we needed to move." Emily said nothing for a moment. "You were already watching." "We were watching the billing anomalies. We didn't have enough to act. Your memo created an internal record that someone with access to the documentation system accessed inappropriately. That gave us the event we needed to pull the access logs, which led us to Gary Spence, which led us to the rest of it." Okafor looked at her steadily. "You did that, not knowing you were doing it, But you did it. Emily sat with that. The people whose records were taken, she said, the patients, will be notified as part of the investigation. There are resources being coordinated for that. Okafor picked up the recorder. It's not a good outcome for them, but it's better than the alternative, which was the operation continuing. She stood. I'll need a full formal statement from you tomorrow, not tonight. She looked at the board, at the green, at the yellow, at the one managed red. Tonight you should finish your shift. She left. Emily sat for another 30 seconds. Then she stood, picked up the marker, and updated the patient count. Holden appeared at the edge of the nursing station. He'd been somewhere else for the last 40 minutes and had the look of a man who'd been thinking rather than moving, which was a different kind of tired. He said, I read your original protocol memo. She looked at him. The full version, he said. Not just the summary I dismissed Thursday. I pulled it from the system tonight while things were quiet. He held her gaze for a moment. It was right, everything in it, the communication sequence, the staging gap, the charge nurse bottleneck. He paused. I underestimated you. Emily said, You ignored the evidence, not just me. He took that. Didn't argue it, didn't deflect it, didn't apologize in the hollow way that's actually a deflection with better grammar. Just took it. Yes, he said. I did. The department around them moved through its controlled late-shift rhythms. Monitors, soft voices, the institutional sound of a building that has survived its worst day and is still, against reasonable expectation, doing its job. Then Voss came back to the floor. He came in through the main entrance, not the administrative corridor, and behind him were two people Emily hadn't seen before, civilian suits, the specific cut of federal officials who had driven from somewhere larger than Raven Falls. One of them was carrying a folder, the physical kind, thick. Behind those two, at the far end of the entrance corridor, 3 members of the hospital's board of directors were arriving. Emily recognized one of them from the framed photo in Fitch's outer office, or rather, Reinhardt's outer office, a room that now belonged to an investigation. They had the look of people who had been on the phone for several hours and had come in person because some things can't be handled remotely. Voss made eye contact with Emily across the room. His expression had shifted from the operational focus of the last 7 hours to something that was harder to read, anticipatory, deliberate. He walked toward her with the federal officials, and the board members walked toward Dr. Holden. And in Emily's pocket, the folded document, her real service record, the unredacted one, the one that contained the 4 years of her life that had been deliberately classified and buried, pressed against her side with the specific weight of a thing that is about to matter. One of the federal officials opened his folder. Ms. Carter, he said, we have some things to discuss. The federal official's name was Harmon. He didn't offer a first name, just the badge and the folder and the specific economy of someone who had flown in from somewhere with more authority than Raven Falls and intended to use it efficiently. He sat across from Emily at the family consultation table, the one Okafor had used earlier, which had apparently become the unofficial federal operations surface for the evening, and he opened the folder and set 3 documents in front of her without preamble. The first was a formal investigation summary. The second was a timeline document, the kind that gets assembled when multiple agencies have been watching something from different angles and finally have enough to put it in sequence. The third was a letter on Department of Justice letterhead that Emily read once, then read again, because the first time she wasn't certain she was reading it correctly. The complaint you filed during your service, Harmon said, the one that was procedurally buried. Yes. It's been formally reopened, as part of the broader investigation into the officer named in your original documentation. He tapped the timeline. He wasn't acting alone. 2 of his superior officers were involved in the decision to classify your complaint and manage your separation. All 3 are currently the subject of a JAG investigation that was already in progress before today. Emily looked at the letter. Before today. Your case was one of 11 similar complaints filed against the same command structure over a 6-year period. None of them went forward through normal channels. The pattern is what generated the current investigation. He paused. Today accelerated the timeline significantly. Colonel Voss's unit has been cooperating with JAG for the past 4 months. His presence here wasn't coincidental. She looked at Voss, who was standing at a slight distance with the particular expression of someone who has been waiting for a conversation to reach a certain point. "You knew," she said to him. "I knew the investigation was active," he said. "I didn't know you'd be here. That part was genuinely coincidental." He paused. Or whatever the word is for coincidental when it turns out to matter. Emily looked back at the letter. It was formal language, the kind that wraps significant things in procedural clothing. Words like reinstatement of record and reversal of separation classification and restoration of commendations. Words that, translated out of their legal register, meant, what was taken from you is being given back. She sat with it for a moment without speaking. The department moved around her. Monitors, soft voices. The pediatric ward was quieter now, and somewhere in the building Marcus, the 7-year-old, was either asleep or asking about his dog again. "What happens next?" she said. "The JAG process takes time," Harmon said, "but the record correction is immediate. As of tonight, your service file reflects your complete history." He closed the folder partway. "There will be hearings. You'll likely be asked to testify. That's not optional, but it's also not something that works against you. Your original documentation was thorough enough that you're a witness, not a subject." "And the officers involved?" "That's not something I can speak to specifically." He said it evenly, not as a deflection, but as a genuine jurisdictional limit. "But the pattern of 11 complaints tells its own story." Emily nodded. She wasn't satisfied by that answer because satisfaction requires closure and closure requires completion, and the JAG process would run for months without her being able to see most of it. She was aware of that. She was also aware that the alternative, the situation as it had stood for the past 4 years, the blank space in her record and the weight of an officially erased history, was over. Finished tonight, in this room, at this particular worn table in a Montana emergency department, which was not where she would have predicted the resolution to land. Nothing about her life had ever resolved where she predicted. She'd stopped predicting. "Okay," she said. Harmon closed the folder. "There's one more thing." He looked at Voss. Voss sat down, which he hadn't done yet. He put his hands flat on the table, which was a posture Emily associated with people who are being direct on purpose. "The Army wants to formally recognize your service," he said. "Not a ceremony. Not yet. That comes later through JAG. But a record entry. Tonight, if you're willing, a formal acknowledgement of your combat medical service and the classified operations you participated in, entered into your file with full documentation." He held her gaze. "It means that file exists, that it's real and complete and nobody can touch it again." She thought about the blank space. 4 years of her life reduced to medical separation and a procedural notation. 4 years of being in places she couldn't name, making decisions she couldn't talk about, carrying outcomes she'd processed alone in apartments and truck cabs, and the empty hours between 2 and 5 in the morning. "Yes," she said, "I'm willing." The documentation took 30 minutes. Voss's JAG officer, a captain who had apparently been in the building since the military convoy arrived and had been working quietly in a side office, brought the forms. Emily signed where she was asked to sign and answered the questions she was asked to answer, and at the end of it she had a copy of a document that contained her actual history, complete and legible, without redactions. She folded it carefully, put it in her pocket with the other one. 2 copies now. She'd probably make more. While Emily had been at the table, the board of directors had been in a different conversation with a different shape. She learned the structure of it from Priya, who had been in earshot during the portion that happened near the nursing station, and from Torres, who had been in Bay 2 with a clear sightline to the administrative corridor. It was the kind of account you get from witnesses who were paying attention to their work but couldn't help noticing what was happening at the edge of their vision, which is often the most accurate kind. The 3 board members had arrived already briefed. Someone had been making calls during the sub-basement incident and the arrest, which was the correct institutional response even if the timing was uncomfortable. They had the surveillance footage, which Okafor's team had pulled from the backup cameras, and the period before the power disruption. They had Emily's protocol memo with its submission timestamp. They had the access log showing who had read it and when. They had Gary Spence in federal custody and a federal investigation in their administrative wing, and a hospital administrator who had turned out to be a 9-year identity fraud. They had, in short, a full picture of what had happened in their building over the last 24 hours, and within it, a very clear image of one specific sequence. A new nurse had identified a critical safety gap on day 3 of her employment, submitted it formally at 7:42 p.m., been publicly dismissed by the trauma chief the following morning, and then managed a 47-patient mass casualty response with military coordination for 7 hours, while the system her memo described failed in exactly the way she'd said it would. Doctor. Holden had been standing near the nursing station when the board arrived. He hadn't moved away, which was either stubbornness or self-awareness, and Emily suspected it was some of both. The board's senior member, a woman named Patricia Osei, who ran the finance committee, and who Priya described as someone who did not conduct conversations for the purpose of reaching conclusions she hadn't already formed, had spoken to Holden directly for approximately 4 minutes. Emily didn't hear the conversation. She heard the end of it because the board had migrated toward the nursing station by that point, and voices carry in hospital corridors the way they carry nowhere else. Patricia Osei said, "Your medical privileges are suspended pending a full review. That review will include the protocol dismissal, the staffing decisions during the event, and every patient outcome from the past 6 hours. You will be notified of the timeline through your department liaison." Holden said, "I understand." There was a pause. "Dr. Holden," Osei said, and her voice had shifted slightly, not softer, more considered. "The fact that you came forward with the terminal access information is noted. The investigation will reflect that." He said, "It's not enough." She said, "No, but it's something." He left the floor shortly after. Not escorted, not formally removed, just a man who picked up his jacket from the hook in Bay 3 and walked out through the main entrance with the posture of someone who has had a very clear accounting and is now carrying it. Emily watched him go from the nursing station. He didn't look back, which she respected. His career at Westbrook Memorial was over. She knew that with the certainty of someone who understood institutions, the review would find what it would find, and some of it would be defensible and some of it wouldn't, and the net result would be the end of his tenure here in whatever form the process produced. Whether he practiced medicine elsewhere, under what conditions, whether the review led to licensing consequences. Those were questions for a process she wasn't part of and wouldn't pretend to predict. What she knew was that 47 patients had come through those doors, and the floor had held, and the outcomes were what they were, and documentation existed for all of it. She turned back to the board and updated the medication schedule for Bay 11. Osei found her 40 minutes later. She was a small woman in her 60s with reading glasses pushed up onto her forehead and the particular economy of movement that comes from spending decades in rooms where decisions had permanent consequences. She sat down at the nursing station. Everyone was using the nursing station now, which was going to require a sanitation pass, and looked at Emily without the preamble of someone who needed to establish authority. "I'm going to ask you directly," Osei said, "because I've spent the last hour reading documents and watching footage, and I find that direct questions save time." "All right," Emily said. "Did you know when you submitted that memo that it might have consequences beyond the protocol issue?" "No," Emily said. "I submitted it because the protocol was wrong and patients were at risk. That's the only reason." Osei studied her for a moment. "And today?" "The response. You were 5 days into this job." "4. 4 days into this job and you ran a 47-patient mass casualty response." "I coordinated with the charge nurse and the military teams," Emily said. "It wasn't solo." "I've seen the footage," Osei said. "And I've read the military response log that Colonel Voss filed an hour ago. He listed you as the primary civilian coordinating officer for the entire event." She paused. "That's not how he documents things he's being generous about. That's how he documents what actually happened." Emily didn't respond to that. "I want to offer you something," Osei said, "and I want to be clear that it's not a gesture. It's a role that needs to exist and that we should have created years ago and didn't, and that's an institutional failure I'm not going to dress up." She set a printed document on the desk. Director of Emergency Preparedness and Military Trauma Training. Full administrative authority over emergency response protocol, mass casualty preparedness, and staff training. You'd be rewriting every protocol in this department from the ground up, with direct reporting to the board. Emily looked at the document without picking it up. You'd also be in charge of the military integration framework, Osei continued. What happened today? The coordination between civilian and military medical response. It worked because of improvisation. We need it to work because of structure. Colonel Voss has agreed to support the framework development. What happened to the previous emergency preparedness officer? Emily said. Osei looked at her steadily. There wasn't one. That's part of what I mean by institutional failure. Emily picked up the document and read it. It was specific in the way real offers are specific. Actual authority, actual reporting structure, actual budget line, actual scope. Not a title given to a problem to make the problem feel managed. A real position with real function. She read it twice. Then she set it down. I want to finish my shift first, she said. Osei almost smiled. Of course. And I want the protocol revision process to start with input from the nursing staff. All of it, not just the charge nurse and the physicians. Every person who works this floor has information that doesn't make it into administrative documentation. Agreed. And I want the military integration framework to be a standing collaboration, not a one-time document. Quarterly reviews, active communication channel with Colonel Voss's unit. I'll arrange it. Emily looked at the board, at the green and the yellow and the one managed red. Then yes, she said. She finished her shift at 11:40 p.m. 14 hours after she'd clocked in, which was not the shift she had been scheduled for, and which violated approximately 4 labor regulations that she and the department would work out later. The last patient she personally managed before the overnight team took over was Marcus, the 7-year-old. She went up to the wardroom during the final hour because she'd been meaning to check on him and kept getting redirected and didn't want to leave without doing it. He was awake, which surprised her. It was late, but the overnight nurse said he'd been sleeping in intervals and waking up asking questions, which was apparently characteristic of him, and something his mother had confirmed with the specific tone of a parent describing a trait that is simultaneously exhausting and evidence that everything is basically okay. His mother was there, a woman in her 30s who had clearly been crying at some point and had stopped and was now in the practical mode that comes after the acute fear has passed. She stood when Emily came in, the reflex of someone who wants to do something useful when the person who helped shows up. You were in the ER, she said. Torres told me you were the one who staged him when he came in. I just got him to the right bay, Emily said. The team did the work. Marcus looked at her from the bed with the specific alertness of a kid who has been in an unusual place for an unusual amount of time and has collected observations. Did they find my dog? He said. Emily said, honestly, I don't know. I haven't heard. He processed this. His name is Copernicus, he said. He's brown. That's a good name for a brown dog, Emily said. My dad named him. He adjusted his pillow with the slight unsteadiness of a kid who still had a residual headache from a concussion. Is my dad okay? Emily looked at his mother. His mother said, he's in surgery, but the doctor said it went well. He's going to be okay. She said it to Marcus, but her eyes stayed on Emily for a second, the look of a person conveying information they've been practicing saying calmly. Emily said to Marcus, your mom's going to stay with you tonight? She has to, he said, with the authority of a 7-year-old stating a rule. I don't sleep good without somebody in the room. That's a reasonable rule, Emily said. She looked at his chart, the concussion notation, the observation parameters, the morning assessment scheduled for 7 a.m., all in order. She said to his mother, the morning team will do a follow-up assessment. If his headache gets worse overnight or he gets disoriented, use the call button immediately. I will. The mother paused. Thank you. For today. Emily said, I hope they find Copernicus. She walked out of the ward and down the corridor and took the elevator back to the ER level, which was quieter now in the specific way of a place transitioning from crisis to recovery. Not peaceful exactly, but a different register of busy, lower and more sustainable. Priya was doing the handoff with the overnight team when Emily got back to the floor. She caught Emily's eye across the nursing station and held it for a second. And in that second, there was a whole conversation that neither of them needed to have out loud. The acknowledgement of a shared day, the specific solidarity of people who have been in something difficult together and have come out the other side still functional. Torres had left already, his shift having ended at 9. He'd left a note on the board, an actual note, handwritten on a torn piece of chart paper, tucked in the corner of the whiteboard where Emily's patient assignments had been all afternoon. It said, "Learned more today than in 8 months. T." She read it and left it there. She walked to her truck at 12:15. The parking lot was cold, in the way Montana parking lots are cold in October. The kind of cold that gets into your ears immediately and makes the air taste like metal. She'd retrieved her jacket from her locker and her bag from the break room and her phone, which had 17 unread messages she hadn't looked at because there hadn't been time. She sat in the truck with the engine off for a moment. The folder from Voss's JAG officer was on the passenger seat. She'd carried it from the consultation table to her locker and back without putting it down during the handoff period, which probably looked strange. She picked it up now and looked at the header again. Her name, her actual service history, her commendations, which had been real and had happened and had been recorded somewhere and could now be seen. 4 years of classified operational service that had been reduced to a blank, restored tonight in a Montana family consultation room by a JAG captain with a portable printer. It didn't fix everything. It didn't unerase the years she'd spent explaining herself without being able to explain herself, or the agency work she'd taken because it was the closest thing available, or the 4 a.m. hours and the careful vagueness of every job application and the particular loneliness of carrying a history you can't show anyone. Those years were what they were. They'd happened. But this was also real. This, too, had happened. She put the folder back on the seat and started the engine. The formal recognition came 6 days later. Not a ceremony in the large theatrical sense. Nothing with bunting or a podium in the traditional configuration. It happened in the main conference room of Westbrook Memorial, which seated 40 and had all 40 seats filled. Nursing staff, residents, the overnight teams who had rotated off but came in anyway, Voss and 2 members of his unit, Okafor, Harmon from the DOJ, Delacroix, Briggs, the board of directors, and Dr. Felice Moran, who sat in the second row and had brought a notepad and took notes throughout in the same compressed shorthand she used for clinical documentation. Colonel Voss spoke first. He was not a natural public speaker. He was a natural briefing room speaker, which is different, and the distinction showed. He spoke in direct sentences without rhetorical shape, which had the effect of making everything he said sound true in the particular way that simple declarative statements sound true. He said that what Emily had done on October 14th in this building was not improvisation. He said it was the application of training and experience and judgment that had been built over 4 years of service in some of the most difficult environments the Army sends medical personnel into. He said that her protocol memo had been the document that broke open a federal investigation that had been stalled for months, and that without it, the operation embedded in this hospital would have continued for longer and done more damage than it ultimately did. He said that her service record, which had been classified and then corrected, reflected a career that any medical officer in his unit would be proud to have. He said all of this without looking at notes. Then he formally entered into the record, the military record, made public here by his specific decision and Okafor's coordination, a citation for Emily's service during the classified operations of her military career. He read the citation in full. It took 4 minutes, because 4 years of real work takes time to describe accurately, even in summary. When he finished, he looked at her. "Sergeant Carter," he said. Emily stood up from her seat. She had not been told to stand. She just did it because the moment had that shape. He saluted. She returned it. Her back was straight and her hand was steady, and her expression was not stoic exactly, because stoic implies suppression, and this wasn't suppression. It was something quieter than emotion and more durable, the look of a person receiving something they always knew was real and are now watching become officially true. The room was silent for 3 seconds. Then Patricia Osei stood, and the board member beside her stood, and Torres stood. He was in the back row, still in his regular clothes, not his scrubs, having clearly come directly from wherever he'd been. And then the room stood, and the sound of it was not theatrical, not the coordinated applause of a performed moment, but the specific sound of people doing something because they meant it. Emily let it land. She didn't minimize it, didn't deflect it, didn't look away. She had spent 4 years becoming very good at accepting diminishment quietly, and the inverse of that skill, it turned out, was being able to accept recognition without flinching. She let it mean what it meant. Osei announced the appointment after Voss sat down. Director of Emergency Preparedness and Military Trauma Training. She described the scope without embellishment, the protocol overhaul, the military integration framework, the staff training mandate. She said that the position would report to the board and that its first project was the complete rewrite of Westbrook Memorial's mass casualty response protocol, which would be completed in collaboration with the nursing staff, the medical staff, and Colonel Voss's unit, and which would be submitted to the State Health Department as a model framework within 90 days. She said the appointment was effective immediately. Then she said, in the particular tone of someone who has been running institutions long enough to know what she's looking at, what happened in this building 9 days ago was a crisis. It was also a demonstration. A nurse on her 4th day of employment identified a systemic failure that had existed for years, documented it precisely, submitted it through proper channels, was dismissed, and then proved in real time under the worst possible conditions that she had been right. The failure wasn't in her judgment. The failure was in the system that didn't listen. She looked at the room. We're correcting that, starting with her. Autumn. After, in the corridor, Moran found Emily. She was young, 27, maybe 28, with the intensity of someone who came to medicine the way people come to things they've decided they owe everything to. She'd been that way in the ER during the crisis, steady and precise and willing to say when she didn't know something, which was rarer than it should be. She said, "The chest patient, Bay 3, William Dray. I remember him. He asked me this morning who caught the pleural effusion. I told him it was a team effort." She paused. "That's accurate, but you were the one who told me to push the imaging priority." "You were the one who flagged the pressure drift," Emily said. "I acted on your read." Moran considered this. "I've been thinking about that, about how, in the meeting, the one Holden ran on Thursday, I was there, I heard you raise the protocol issue." She didn't look away. "I didn't say anything." "You were a second-year resident in that room," Emily said. "That's not an excuse." "No," Emily said. "It's not, but it's a reason." She held Moran's gaze. "The next time you see something wrong, you have more standing than you did then. Use it." Moran nodded. She started to turn away, then stopped. "The way you ran the board," she said, "during the event. I've been thinking about it. You were doing 3 things simultaneously: clinical assessment, resource allocation, communication triage, and you were keeping them in separate tracks. I've never seen anyone do that without a formal command system." "It's a learnable skill," Emily said. "Will you teach it?" Emily looked at her for a moment. "Show up to the first protocol training session. Bring your notepad." Moran said, "I will," and meant it in the way people mean things when they're going to follow through. The last conversation was with Voss. They stood near the exit, in the same corridor where Okafor had told Emily not to discuss what she knew with anyone here. Different context, same hallway. "The JAG hearings," Emily said. "Timeline? 6 months, maybe 8. They're not going to move fast because they're building something comprehensive, not something quick." He looked down the corridor. "You'll be called, probably twice. Once for your own complaint and once as a corroborating witness for several of the others." "I know." "Are you all right with that?" She thought about it honestly, which meant acknowledging that it wasn't a comfortable prospect. Sitting in a formal hearing room and going through it again, systematically, for the record, in front of people whose job was to assess what happened. It wasn't something she wanted, it was something she would do. "Yes," she said. He nodded. "For whatever it's worth." He stopped, reorganized the sentence. "I heard about your separation through the network. Afterward. There were people who knew what it actually was. He looked at her directly. Nobody did anything, including people who could have. She waited. That's on us, he said. Not just the officers directly involved. The system that watched it happen and calculated that it was easier not to act. He held her gaze. I'm sorry for that. She absorbed it, not easily. It sat with the accumulated weight of the last 4 years in a way that was uncomfortable and honest. She didn't tell him it was fine because it wasn't fine. She didn't tell him it didn't matter because it did. Thank you for saying it, she said. That's where I'll leave it for now. He accepted that. They shook hands, which was formal and also genuine, two things that aren't mutually exclusive but don't always manage to coexist. He left. She stood in the corridor alone for a moment, not lost in it, not dramatizing it, just being in it. The hospital moved around her, the ordinary ongoing work of a place that treats people at their most vulnerable, that had been infiltrated and had survived the infiltration, that had failed and had been forced by circumstances and by one specific person's insistence on documentation to examine those failures honestly. It wasn't a good institution made better by a dramatic crisis. It was an imperfect institution with real problems that now had a documented record of those problems and a structure in place to address them. That was a meaningfully different thing than inspiring, and it was a more durable thing, because inspiring fades and structural change has paperwork. She walked to the nursing station, picked up the marker. The new charge nurse, a woman named Delgado who had transferred from the Deering Hospital in the aftermath and who moved with the competence of someone who had already processed one crisis this month and was not interested in processing another, looked at her. You don't have to do that, Delgado said. The board update. I know, Emily said. I'm doing it anyway. She updated the patient count. Green across the board, 2 yellows moving toward green, the one red now reclassified as serious but stable. William Dre was in recovery, and his pressure had been holding since the drain. Marcus had gone home that morning. His father had come out of surgery 2 days earlier, and the dog, Copernicus, had been found unharmed 3 hours after the crash by a county animal control officer who had seen the news and gone looking. Torres had sent her a message about that. She'd read it at 5 in the morning and hadn't replied yet because she wasn't sure what to say, but she'd read it 3 times. She capped the marker, stepped back from the board. The department around her ran the way a department should run. Not perfectly, because nothing runs perfectly, but with the particular functional rhythm of people who know their jobs and do them and watch for each other when the pressure builds. That was all it ever was. That was all it needed to be. She thought about what she would say at the first protocol training session, which was scheduled for the following Tuesday with the nursing staff. She'd been turning it over since Ose made the appointment, not the logistics of it, but the beginning, the first thing, the thing you say before the framework and the documentation and the specific technical corrections. She'd been dismissed on a Thursday morning for raising a concern about a protocol that existed to protect patients. She'd documented it anyway, and then she'd been inside the proof of it for 7 hours. What she'd say at the start of the session was this: real leadership begins when you listen before you judge. That sounds simple. It isn't. It requires choosing accuracy over comfort, which is harder than people admit, because comfort is available right now, and accuracy sometimes takes time, and you have to be willing to wait for it and look foolish in the interval. The person in the room who is quietest is not always the person with the least to say. The person who is newest is not always the person with the least to know. Every system has a blind spot, and the blind spot is usually in the direction nobody is looking, which is usually toward the people the system has decided don't matter enough to pay close attention to. This protocol exists because someone paid close attention. Keep paying it. For the patients and for each other and for the next person who walks into this building on day 4 of a new job and sees something nobody else has noticed yet. Listen to that person. She walked to the exit, pushed through the door into the Montana cold, into the dark parking lot with its ordinary fluorescent overhead lights and its smell of pavement and coming winter, and she stood there for a moment in her jacket with the 2 folded documents in her pocket. The mountains were invisible in the dark, but she knew they were there. That was the thing